Okay, we are here in Unit 4, which is the classical era. This is my favorite era of music. It's where we get to introduce music that is much more familiar to you, such as Haydn's, Mozart's, and Beethoven's music. And we'll be studying these guys in greater depth as we go along throughout the unit. I started out with this picture here because architecture is very relatable to music in this particular time frame. We find that a simple, clear line is one of the most valuable parts of music during this time, and it's reflected in architecture as well. Classicism, we're looking at the Greek and Roman models from antiquity, and they are brought back into the culture of the 18th century. The aristocracy is still in charge. However, we find near the middle to end of this particular era, revolution is in the air. This time frame goes from 1750 to 1825. We had, of course, the American Revolution in the 1770s and the French Revolution in the 1790s. And that's actually where the middle class really starts to shine after this particular time period, and the series of patronage will change. We no longer have the aristocracy with as much power, so musicians aren't going to be working in that culture once we move into the Romantic era. In music, the idea of classicism becomes very important. Those simple, clear melodies, harmonies are clear and easy to understand. The music is very vibrant during this time, and we really have some unequivocal masters. Mozart and Beethoven often overshadow Haydn, who is also a genius in his own field. He, of course, played a lot of the same types of music, composed a lot of the same types of music as Mozart and Beethoven, but Haydn was a little bit before Mozart and Beethoven, and he really set the style for a lot of these different forms. Form becomes very important during this time. Sonata form in particular, I will be talking more about this. Now, this last point here, bold and ceaseless experimentation. We see that these masters, or all of the musicians during this time, had to live within these different forms. We're going to talk about the different forms that are in the music that we're listening to. And because of the strict adherence to form, they really had to experiment within these forms, and it really caused them to grow as musicians in ways that you wouldn't expect. So this is quite an interesting time in music. One last thing I'd like to mention before we go on to our chapters is this idea of moving from the palace to the concert hall. As the aristocracy begins to wane, so we also have the rise of the public concert. Now, this is kind of all happening at the same time. It's not like all of a sudden we had a revolution and all the kings are dead, and so, oh no, what are we going to do? This happened over a longer period of time, where we do have the rise of the public concert, and the public became very eager to hear music. Vienna was really the center of, or the musical universe at the time. So in Vienna, we have a lot of composers that are creating new works on a weekly, monthly basis. And so these concert goers would go to these subscription concerts where they would subscribe to be able to hear the new and innovative works of these composers. And music did become a communication between the performers and between the listener and the composer. We also have the rise of the conductor in this late part of the era, and into the Romantic period of time as well. So let's move right on to the next chapter. Chapter 28 explores chamber music, and we're going to talk specifically about Haydn, who was a master at chamber music and with the symphony as well. He did a lot more with what we call absolute music, which doesn't have a program. When we looked at Vivaldi's Spring in the last unit, we saw that there was a program attached to it. We had singing birds, and we had a brook, and we had a storm, indicative of springtime. This is absolute music. It doesn't necessarily tell a story. It's just meant to be music for music's sake. We're going to talk about theme, which is a melodic idea, motives, which are small parts of the theme, and then how these composers developed these themes through the use of form. Now, chamber music is a type of music that is an ensemble. It usually runs from, it says here, 2 to 10 performers. You've got one player in a part, so a lot of solo work in there, but working together as a group. String quartet was the most popular. It was 2 violins, a viola, and a cello, and there were many, many works written for string quartet at that time. We will be studying Joseph Haydn's Emperor Quartet. I'm going to be showing that here in just a moment. Within this idea of absolute music, you know, not having a story or a text line or anything, the idea of form became really important. And that's where we come up to our first chart, the multi-movement cycle. This is a sequence of what we call movements. If you've ever been to an orchestra concert and the orchestra's playing and then it sounds like the end and everybody kind of shuffles around and then they start playing again. You might have 3 movements, you might have 4 movements, 5 or even 6 movements as we move into the Romantic and 20th century. But basically, this kind of gets solidifies here, this multi-movement cycle. And typically, the sonata or the chamber music forms that you're going to be seeing here, they usually have 4 movements. The first movement is usually fast, fairly long. It's in the sonata allegro form, which we'll be talking about a little more. The second movement is often slow. It might have a ternary form, or it might be something called theme and variation, where you have a melody and we vary the melody, very much like that Benjamin Britten piece that we heard in Unit 1. The third movement is, well, it says it's optional, but it was there quite often once we kind of get rolling in the classical era. And it is sometimes in 3. It's more like a dance. You might think of it like a waltz, quite fast generally. Minuet would be a little bit slower, scherzo, quite fast. And then the fourth movement will be fast. It's going to be really spirited, as we see here, because this is the end of the piece. This is where we want the audience to leave going, wow, that was really fun. I really enjoyed that. So the last movement is usually pretty fast and spirited in this case. Now, Joseph Haydn is actually one of my favorite people. He was really kind of like a regular guy. He had a nickname. People actually called him Papa Haydn because he was a seriously nice guy. He was born in Austria, became a choir boy up into the age of about 17. At this time in history, actually boys went through puberty, girls too, quite a bit later. So he didn't have his voice change until late in his teenage years. But when his voice did change, he had to find another job. He worked within Vienna for a couple of years, but then took a job in Hungary with the Esterházys. And he lived there for a great deal of his life. He actually became quite famous for a lot of the music that he was putting out there. When Esterházy died, his brother, I think Nicholas II might have been, don't quote me on that though, decided that he really didn't care for music the way his brother did. So he disbanded the orchestra. And when he did that, Haydn actually moved on to England and did a series of concerts where he put on something with what we call the London Symphonies, which is part of this mature classical style. He really goes on to solidify the symphony, which we'll be talking about, I think, in chapter 29. The Emperor Quartet is what we're going to be listening to. It is the second movement. And so if we go back and look at that multi-movement cycle, we know that movement 2 is usually slow. So we will see this is a hymn tune that actually ended up being Austria's national anthem. And it takes on the role of theme and variation. So that's our form that we have for this particular movement. Let's take a listen to this. We'll hear the theme, and it might sound familiar to you because it is indeed the Austrian national anthem. So let's listen to the theme and a little bit of a variation so that you know what a variation actually is. Now, if we go on to Variation 1, we can hear the same melody, but we can definitely hear some differences. So what we actually have is one of the violins playing the melody and the other one playing kind of this counterpoint idea above it so that it varies that original theme. Now I want to talk super quick about what a coda is. A coda usually means some sort of ending. So we have a little tag or a little ending to the end of this that doesn't match with the theme. It's a little bit different, and we call this the coda, or the tag ending, or the coda. Oh, and there's that nice final chord. So that's the Emperor Quartet. You can take more time and listen to the whole thing. It's very pleasant. It's very nice to listen to. So take a little bit more time with this piece. We're going to move on to the Haydn Symphony. Now, when we talk about this piece of music called the Symphony, it is played quite a bit with modern orchestras. Most of the time we do play a symphony when we play a concert. It's usually on the second half of the program because it's a longer work. It's a multi-movement work. It began as a 3-movement piece, fast, slow, fast, and eventually moved into the 4 movements because the minuet was then added. The classical orchestra was quite a bit smaller than our modern orchestra today. We have generally between 30 to 40 players. The strings and the woodwinds did most of the work, and then the brass and percussion came in as filler, as more interest, as different timbre. The military symphony that we're going to be listening to, Haydn does a great job using brass and percussion, and that's actually why it's called the military symphony, because it kind of sounds like a military band with the use of the brass and the percussion in this. I really want to point out how vastly different this sounds than our Baroque music that we were just listening to. If we go back to listen to even, say, the Brandenburg concertos or the music by Bach, we hear that it has a lot of, there's just a lot of notes that are involved. In this case, we hear the melody is going to be very clear. It's very easy to recognize, and you could even sing it if you wanted to. And so that's why they say the classical era is characterized by singable melodies, because they are very easy to recognize. So this is an ABA form. It's a 3-part form, ternary form. So let's listen to the beginning and then actually listen to part B. Okay, so there's a repeat there. Let's go on to section B, and you can really hear the use of that brass and percussion here. The other thing you notice here, we have these little things, they're called flats, and we've actually changed the key. We're now in a minor mode, so if you notice, it doesn't sound quite as bright. It sounds a little bit darker, and that's the change in mode to a minor key. So if we go to the end, this is the coda, this is that tag ending. So this is quite unusual at the time, especially to have a solo trumpet and then to end with such a majestic fanfare, especially in the second movement. So Haydn quite innovative here and really interesting. And this is what we call the symphony. This is movement 2, and there are 4 movements all together.